Hello and welcome to the Air and Cosmos studio, where we have the honor and privilege today of welcoming General Nicolas Richoux. Good morning, Xavier Teitelman and General. As the former commander of the 7th Armored Brigade, you led half of France's tanks. How many was that? About 100 tanks, Leclerc's, that's it?
100, there are 200. In the French army then, divided between two heavy brigades, there are only two heavy brigades, the 2nd and the 7th. The 2nd is in Strasbourg and the 7th in Besançon. I had the honor of commanding the 7th Armored Brigade.
All right, I'm going to tease you. Let's talk about the tank. Is there still a future for the battle tank, considering what we're seeing in Ukraine? My first question is, what were the balances we had before the war and how? Despite Russia's military advantage, they couldn't win the war, proving tanks aren't the ultimate weapon. No, the tank is not
the ultimate weapon. It never has been. And so it's even less so today, where we're on a front line with trenches. The tank is a very interesting weapon because it's heavily armored, it's fast, and it has a lot of firepower. So it's a breakthrough weapon. But once we're on static front lines, the tank becomes vulnerable. That is to say, once the tank is stationary, it's vulnerable to artillery, it's vulnerable to aircraft, and as we've seen during this war, now it's also vulnerable to drones. So its usefulness on a static front line is indeed very, very, very diminished right now. That's absolutely certain. Does that mean the future of the tank is compromised? I don't think so. Because tomorrow, if there's a breakthrough, if we want to win the war, at some point we have to break through. And to break through, we're going to need armor. So probably under conditions a bit different from those we've known up to now, because the drone is a real problem for the tank today. But we'll still need personnel under armor to be able to carry out this push in depth, which will allow one side or the other. Besides, we can't know today who will win. So the tank probably still has a use, but we can talk about it again. We'll definitely have to seriously reconsider how it's used in the
months and
the years to come.
Okay, so of course we need to evolve. We're in a trench warfare situation where the tank is no longer capable. But we've also seen it, for example, in the Kursk area. We've seen that the tank was used in open plains where there was movement. It still allowed the Ukrainians to quickly take 1,200 square kilometers in just a few weeks. So we can see that there's still this potential. But if tomorrow we face static or mobile wars with trenches, are we forced to have tanks that simply serve as artillery pieces, more or less fixed, mobile in the rear? We could really imagine that we might get hundreds of tanks again, which could achieve a breakthrough and have their effect, as we imagine
in the doctrines. So in defense, the tank is useful, meaning it can serve as a reserve, but to protect it, it has to be in the rear at the handle of the fen of the front, so it can intervene at a threatened spot on the front. That will be its primary use. If you use it like an artillery piece behind the front, just behind the front, well, there's a good chance that sooner or later it will be destroyed. But when we talk about an offensive, the offensive and the breakthrough, there are two phases in a breakthrough. There are the troops who are going to break open the enemy front, so you need a lot of troops, 3 to 5 against 1, so breaking open the enemy front, opening it like this, like a pair of pliers being spread apart. So that takes time, it requires a large force, and then you need, with losses, most likely a breakthrough, which means that when the front is open, these troops generally no longer have the strength to exploit it. And so that's when, if the front is open, the tanks rush into the breach and can then exploit it in depth. If you send a tank to a heavily fortified front line with field barriers, mines, and so on, several lines in depth of trenches, obviously, you're going to get destroyed. So it can't be the tank that causes the breakthrough at some point. It will be the artillery, it will be the high mobility artillery rocket system that will clear the mines with sub-munitions that will try to open up the terrain a little bit ahead. And at that moment, the breakthrough might be possible.
Today we mostly see bulldozers and demining systems with many men on foot, followed by the arrival of tanks.
There you go. So unfortunately, I believe that today the breakthrough can only be, the breakthrough is more about the infantry. The engineers are crucial. The artillery will crush the enemy, allowing us to advance, and the engineers will clear the mines. And when that's done, well, at that point, the tank will be able to move in. The tank remains vulnerable. There will always be drones and so on. But at least it will be able to do it. And when we see the breakthrough, the tank remains very useful in areas that are not fortified. That is to say, it allows you to move forward very quickly, to cover 30, 50, 70 kilometers in a day, and to push back the opponent before he has the
time to get organized. And if we look at efficiency, so the cost-effectiveness ratio, when we look at the equivalence, the effectiveness of the strikers, or in France, for example, the Jaguar, do we finally ask ourselves, couldn't we have even lighter vehicles with slightly smaller cannons, but with the well-known new armor-piercing shells in larger quantities at a lower cost? Wouldn't prioritizing quantity be preferable? Yes.
Most likely we can have lighter vehicles and then make more of them. Now, when you're in a high-intensity theater, armor is absolutely important to protect the soldier. But the Jaguar is a vehicle that was created to go to Africa that can be airlifted in an A400M and so on. But it's still not made for high-intensity combat. The Striker is a combat vehicle for infantry and mechanized infantry, while the Jaguar currently is not. The Véhicule blindé de combat d'infanterie, I had Véhicule blindé de combat d'infanterie S. I had 3 regiments of Véhicule blindé de combat d'infanterie S in my brigade. That's heavy, they're wheeled, but that's really heavy equipment. Who is capable of going after the enemy in the crossfire while protecting the soldier? The tank that's too light, we saw it with the Amixis reconnaissance car, which we took for a tank. I commanded a unit of Amixis reconnaissance car when I was a captain. It's a very light armor. It protects against the 5.56, the 7.62, but not beyond that. Even the 12.7 starts to penetrate. So indeed, if you use vehicles that are too light in a breakthrough, you're going to get destroyed. Armor is absolutely essential. So it's always about finding the right balance between mobility, armor, and firepower. And so in high-intensity combat like this, I think armor will always be very, very important for an army that aims to break through at some point.
And do you imagine, in 10 or 15 years, having more heavy ground drones, typically unmanned tanks that would be coordinated by a platoon leader who would be a bit further back?
Yes, that's possible, but we still don't know the conditions for the main ground combat system to happen. But the main ground combat system, that is the main ground combat system. The tank of the future being developed with Germany will be the counterpart to the well-known SCAF
Is the plane
of the future, also being developed with the Germans. Well, it will have a whole environment. It will be connected with drones, maybe ground drones, but also aerial drones that will be able to fly at the same time as it does, lighting up the terrain ahead and maybe even fighting enemy drones. Because that's the condition for the tank to be protected. If the tank goes in alone without protection, it will be destroyed today. One of the major changes on today's battlefield is the inability to protect oneself. It's very complex and there's no protection day or night. Back in my youth, when we were in a tank, we would do a maneuver. To be relatively safe from attacks, one simply had to reach the middle of a forest or take cover behind a hill. Planes and helicopters were scarce, appearing only occasionally. We took risks, but they were quite limited. Drones can appear anytime, day or night, regardless of the situation. Drop a small bomb through the hatches and then destroy a 10 million euro tank with a small bomb and a drone that costs just a few €100. That's what it really is. And so that's very exhausting for the fighter indeed, because the threat takes many forms. It comes from everywhere, all the time. On the other hand, the tank of the future will be much better protected against these threats thanks to all the connected environment it will have with it.
So that means two things. It means there is more equipment around to protect with anti-hydrogen defense systems. And
also more expensive, so.
That also means a
race, of course, you should never ever forget that. That is to say, the equipment and all that, we've seen it since the Second World War. Producing a T-34 or a Sherman is not the same as producing a Charles Leclerc, a Challenger, or an Abrams. It costs much more, and the connectivity that will be produced tomorrow will increase the cost of each weapon system. And it's actually a system of systems. We know weapon systems, but there will be systems of systems, meaning systems connected with other systems that will allow for collective protection to create a kind of bubble, ultimately, that will allow us to move forward. However, that will be very costly for the military, which is why it's crucial to raise defense budgets.
So I start from the principle that I accept the idea that the tank will still be useful tomorrow. But on the other hand, won't its relative importance in the context of combat decrease in favor of a larger force? Other small equipment that will accompany it? It will be less of a centerpiece. No, I think
that it will remain a centerpiece. Because when you go to the ground, at some point you have to have ground troops who will go in. Drones won't win the war. Even an unmanned drone can just go straight ahead. But at some point you have to occupy the ground, so we will always need men to go along. So I still think that the importance of drones, whether ground or aerial, will increase to save human lives. But at some point, if we want to conquer, if we want to occupy the trench across from us, when we get there, we don't equip it with drones. We're going to need people on the ground. And then there's always the issue of the central role of the person who makes decisions in combat. That is, we can't entrust combat to drones. Now, that's the ethical problem, what we call lethal autonomous weapon systems. Lethal autonomous weapon systems. That means they would be able to decide and discriminate on their own. What is the target in front of them? And that's something our adversaries are probably willing to do, but not us.
Units.
Western ones, because it raises a very serious ethical issue. How do you tell a mother in a city with her stroller from a fighter?
For example, when examining the field, particularly regarding the MG16, our focus is more on the 2045 horizon. Are there any concrete signs of change that we see in South Korea, Russia, Ukraine, or the United States? Are there things today that make you say that? We've found a key, we've found a direction. Is it simply that we need to improve our self-protection, reinforcement, and drone detection capabilities without expecting any revolution? So
it's hard to say. Personally, I don't think the work on the MGSS is advanced enough to be able to say. There will always be a platform that looks like a tank, whatever it is. I think the revolution that will happen, but that's not a revolution, I don't think so. On the other hand, what will be the revolution is the environment, indeed. It's the connectivity, how we use it, how, for example, drones that would protect or attack the enemy drones, or that would be able to support tanks as reconnaissance units. Yesterday, several kilometers ahead to scout for enemies and assess threats. That's what's really going to change. Now, the tank, there will always be a need for it. It will probably still have tracks. There will always be a crew inside. There will always be a cannon. It will surely be optimized with a lot of things. But I don't think it's a revolution. That's not the revolution. The revolution is not about the weapons themselves, but the system that accompanies them. So it's the system of systems that's really going to bring about a very big change.
On the battlefield. That's why even on the Leclerc Evo, which would be the evolution after the XLR, they're adding a fourth crew member, precisely to manage this ecosystem that's around it.
Yes, that is to say, the problem with all this is that you'll have to be more and more of a polytechnic engineer to operate a tank on the move. Really, it's screens and so on. You have to do a lot of things at the same time, so it's really very complicated. It will be both expensive and at the same time it will require people increased technical complexity, a technical complexity that you'll have to be able to handle under the stress of battle. All of that isn't easy. We can't let technology kill the fight. And when focused on your screen, it's similar to being on your phone. You stop noticing the people passing by. We shouldn't let technology dominate the fight. We mustn't be so focused on our screens that we fail to see our opponent.
And so, in the end, when we require ourselves to have very advanced technologies that end up being very expensive, is it really worth it? Isn't there a risk when facing a country like Russia, which is able to produce a lot of low-quality equipment while accepting many losses? Isn't there a risk that we might end up losing this war?
That means that numbers still remain an important factor, despite everything we might say. But it also means that technical expertise, when you don't have the numbers, can actually compensate for a lot of things. But you shouldn't forget, when you want to break through, that numbers remain a fundamental element of combat. Regardless of what you say and the acceptance of losses, because you can't say you're going to break through, that you're going to win a war from the safety of a tank, and then without taking any losses. A breakthrough on a Ukrainian front will undoubtedly come at a high cost in terms of human lives. Are our Western societies ready to accept losses like that? And so with our 200 tanks, how many do we need? Our 200 tanks may seem few compared to their losses of 1,000, 1,500, or even 2,000 tanks.
3,000?
3,000, you can feel it now. Even we're at 15,000, maybe 20,000 in terms of all the armored vehicles. But
so
if we have 3,000 tanks with 200, you see, we can hold out for a month, 2 months maybe, assuming they're well protected and we can preserve them. But indeed, today, if we raise the budget to 3.55, maybe we'll have to consider several hundred additional tanks. Are these the choices that will be made? We have other options. I mean, we can see that in the programming plans, space is very important. Cyber is
Very important.
And that often the budget increases, as we can see. The programming law that was passed is being upheld, which is one of the first I've seen actually being enforced in my life. Well, this programming law is just making up for years when we were on a tight budget. In 2014, 2015, the defense budget was set to be 31 billion euros. We're now over 50 billion, and we're at 2%. To reach 3.5 or even 5, we need a budget of 100 or 120 billion. We need to recalculate that precisely. And so that's another dimension. The nation has to be willing to make that effort.
Come on, lots of beautiful tanks, more tanks, so we don't have to use them. Well, there you go. It's so...
Pack the parabellum. To have peace, prepare for war during peacetime. Because when you build it, a military apparatus, it's a 10 or 20-year project. It's not. I've decided to create, and it'll be done by tomorrow morning, as mass production is very complicated. And then you also need the men to serve, meaning if you create a regiment, for example, to have 800 tanks or 1,000 tanks, you'll have to create tank regiments. You need a pyramid of ranks. Where do they come from? You need officers, 15 years, 20 years to train an officer and so on. It takes several years to train non-commissioned officers and technicians. If you want to recreate this army we're talking about, more substantial, with more manpower, the French army will need to start investing the resources right now. Maybe 20 years.
I have an off-topic question because you're also a historian on the Roman Empire, right? Yes, in the Roman Empire, they had the equivalent of the chariot. Ah, yes, that's the legion.
Very clearly, the legion is the breakthrough tool. It's the Roman legionary. He had his environment. There was a system of systems. That's what I call the legionary weapon system. And the legionary weapon system is the legion that's made for breakthroughs. So the block that attacks these 6,000 men, around it there's an ecosystem including cavalrymen who are auxiliaries, but auxiliaries doesn't mean useless people. It's crucial that the Germans, Gauls and others supplied them. There were archers, several thousand archers, often provided by the Asians, because the
Asian archers?
They could shoot almost up to 500,000 men. There were slingers. There was absolutely everything. And so indeed the Roman army was a true ecosystem at the center of which. But the Roman army isn't just a legion, it's all of that. So they truly invented combined arms combat. Did you have joint tactical groups back then? Absolutely, since that's what we called vexillations. And so we were able to form, from the legions and auxiliaries, marching units with exactly the components they needed to carry out a mission. Today we call that a combined arms tactical group, and back then it was called a vexillation. So we absolutely didn't invent anything. Modern combined arms combat, artillery, engineers, cavalry, infantry, and so on, was invented by the Romans. That's a certainty. At the center of which, the chariot, it was the Roman infantry.
They had the concept of the chariot, but chariots came later. It's not ideal in general. Thank you very much. With pleasure. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you very soon at the Recosmos studio.